Hello YouTube and welcome back. We've been playing something that I've tongue-in-cheek called a couple different things. You might call this a Warpath Lich, you might call this a Bleed RF or a Bleed Warpath kind of thing, but we're dealing damage in a circle because Last Epoch is one of the premier action RPGs on the market for dealing damage in a circle. So we are channeling Ghostflame, not as a Warlock, but instead as a Lich, because we wanted to see what kind of Ghostflame, Ghost Rider, channeled AoE damage thing of death we can become while zooming around about 400 corruption or so. So I've not pushed my characters to 1000 corruption because I jump around characters too often, but I have had quite a bit of fun playing this one at 400 corruption. So before we jump into the particulars of this build, I want to tell you a couple things that really stand out to me about why this build is interesting, what I liked about it, and things I didn't like about it, and then after that, we will jump into the character itself, and I can show you the iterations of the build too. So the things that I do really like about Ghostflame is it kind of stands out as a shift in a new direction about what EHG is doing with skills. In the past, there's been complaints to EHG about where the more multipliers come from and how you're able to scale your damage. If you look at some of the older skills in Last Epoch, you'll see that they have like 10 out of 10 nodes, and you're expected to put all 10 points into it in order to scale your damage. Or you might look at an old skill like Earthquake, for example, which simply has so many more multipliers on it. It's got so many more multipliers. So the complaint is if a skill has more multipliers, it's good. If a skill doesn't have more multipliers, it's not good. And me as a player, I wish I had more agency in determining whether a skill was good. Where can I get my damage multipliers from? So over time, we've seen the addition of more and more multipliers that are not necessarily on the skill tree, but rather on gear or skill trees or masteries instead, which is great. So enter Ghostflame. Ghostflame, you've seen a lot of people using this as a movement skill or as a defensive skill, which is wonderful. But our build here, we're trying to harmonize two pieces. We want to have a movement skill zooming around the map, but we also want it to be our primary source of damage. So we tried two different things. We tried some spell dot, we tried some spell crit stuff using some other things that proc, and we tried some bleed with this character. But across all of those, Ghostflame, it has more multipliers in its skill tree. We haven't taken a single one of them. There's too many other things that I want to be taking instead. I want to have the damage go in a full circle around my character. I want to have the mana feel remotely manageable. I want to do all number of things with the skill tree that aren't just the more multipliers in the skill tree. So for this build here, you'll see that we have about 5 more multipliers, and none of them come from Ghostflame itself. We have boots, we have unique items, we have masteries, we have other skills that give us more multipliers that apply to Ghostflame. And that's awesome because it means that we can use a skill that doesn't necessarily have more multipliers on it. So that really stands out as one of the things that I do like about this skill a lot. On the other hand, the things that I don't necessarily like about Ghostflame is, well, it's a channeling skill. It has insane access to defense, even if you ignore the word generation, which I'm ignoring the word generation because I'm playing a Death Seal Lich, where oftentimes I just delete all of my ward. This skill, while channeling, you have access to the less damage taken modifiers in the Warlock skill tree. You have access to 2 separate less damage taken modifiers in the skill tree itself. You have access to the armor while channeling blessing, which is like 2 or 3 times higher than the normal flat armor blessing. You just have so much defense built into holding down one button instead of doing other things instead. And lo and behold, when you stop holding down that button, if you stop holding down that button, you lose all of those layers of defense. So it means that your gameplay is kind of binary. When you're channeling, you feel like God tier, and when you're not channeling, you're not God tier. So there is a place where I died on this character, and I actually died in this very similar way often. I died like maybe 5 or 6 times on our way to level 100, and every time that I would die, it was because I was using Transplant sort of as a mana battery to get my mana back up in order to solve my mana problems. And every time that I would transplant has a cast time. So I'd like maybe a quarter second at the beginning of transplant, a quarter second at the end of transplant before I started channeling again, I would die. Or I'd be transplanting into a line of fire or away from a line of fire, and I just put myself in a precarious situation. It is something that you can play around. You can do better than me. You can pay more attention than I do, but that's still kind of the issue with Ghostflame. Like, you have all this defense, and if you stop channeling, all of a sudden you're kind of a different character. So that's something that I definitely do not like about this build, and that is something that I take issue with channeling builds in general. That aside, let's talk about this particular version of the build. We had a spell version of this build and an ailment version of the build. In the spell version of the build, we tried out very initially trying to scale the damage off of marrow shards. We had a Marina's Lost Soul, which meant that all of our AoE damage, instead of being a fizz dot, was necrotic, because we have a bunch of necrotic damage coming from Marinas. And then our marrow shards, despite being a physical skill, was primarily dealing necrotic damage, again, because of all the flat damage from Marinas. And then we also used a Rot Mind, which is a really interesting inclusion. It gives us some extra protection from damage over time. It gives us AoE. It gives us some flat damage, but it also gives us +1 to damage over time skills, which let us get from like 24 to 25 to 27, maybe even 28 plus levels to skills on our Ghostflame, so that we can grab all the procs and less damage taken, and the movement speed and the mana considerations and the extra AoE that we wanted from the Ghostflame skill tree. So that said, this skill and how I built it, trying to like deal damage with it, it was really a question of maybe 2, maybe 3 things. One was, can we get enough plus levels to skills on Ghostflame to make this playable? Can I do the things that I want? So like for me, the very first thing for this build is like +4 to Ghostflame on your helmet, and then maybe an Omnis because it has +1, or maybe a Rot Mind because it has +1, or maybe you could use a Thornslinger belt because it gives +1 to physical skills if you convert to physical, or maybe you could even use the Acolyte relic. The Acolyte one is like, +1 Acolyte skills. You could use that as well. Anything that gives you +1 gives you a lot of value, because it gives you access to other, odds and ends across your other skills. And then most importantly, you're probably speccing more into the less damage taken, or some extra damage, or some extra AoE, or even some extra movement speed on Ghostflame itself for quality of life. So the plus levels are very, very valuable. As we transitioned, we ended up not really enjoying. We kind of felt like we found like the soft cap of damage, and it wasn't churning out the kind of numbers that I wanted to. And it also still kind of felt clunky, because the second thing that we needed to do in order to solve this Ghostflame as a damage skill, other than 1, get as many plus levels as possible, is 2, figure out what to do about the mana. So the mana is tricky. You'll see that we sorted for these very early on, but we have 13, 14, 13, 13, 13 for our mana efficiency, and of course 14 is the maximum roll. So you want as much mana efficiency from your idols as possible. So that's the second part of the build. Plus levels is number 1, mana and figuring out your mana is the second thing. There are some cute things that you can do, but really my appreciation for this build, this playstyle, and why I played it for so long and experimented, is that we wanted to use Transplant as a way of generating mana for us. So with as much cooldown recovery speed as possible, our mana goes down, we transplant like this, and for that quarter second, at the beginning and the end of the transplant, I am vulnerable. I might die, or I might be in a sticky situation at that point. But if I'm watching the screen, or not talking to Twitch chat, or if I'm being careful, I'll be pretty tanky the entire time there. So that is how we were resolving our mana. Other things that you might consider doing instead in terms of mana, other things that you might do for mana instead, well, we talked about having cooldown recovery speed for transplant. You could even use a Wrong Warp. Wrong Warp has spell damage on it, but my version of the build, I'm playing Bleed. So you're really only using this for cooldown recovery speed for transplant and the extra movement speed that it gives you, which is, it's fun, it's nice and zoomy. Do note that there's a bug with Wrong Warp right now. I know, bug in my last epoch, more common than you might think, but it actually gives you less cooldown recovery speed than it says it does, so it's not as good as it looks based on that 36% in the very bottom of the screen there. So using that with cooldown for transplant for giving you mana is one option. Another option that you might consider instead is just getting as much minus mana cost as possible. We consider trying to re-gear this entire character as Ignite instead of Bleed, and use the -4 from Firestarter's Torch, maybe LP, a -5 on top of that, and then you get a -9 spell mana cost, and that spell mana cost also applies to the channel cost of the skill. So you can get it nice and low, and maybe augment that with 1 or maybe 2 other things to solve for your mana. Of course, the very first thing that we tried with Ghostflame was using Marrow Shards, and then in the Marrow Shard skill tree, grabbing the mana gain stuff over here. But of course, this makes a lot of sense for a crit. This makes a lot of sense for a crit version of the build, because there's a lot of support for hit-based damage in Marrow Shards. But once we transition to being a Bleed build, there is significantly less support for Bleed-based damage in Marrow Shards. There's virtually none. So, and the other couple things that you might consider when it comes to solving for your mana is, really cute idea is using a Chronicle of the Damned in your offhand. This gives you mana gain each second per active Wandering Spirit. So what you would do with this is you would you have chance to reveal Wandering Spirit on kill. You'd spec into your Wandering Spirits, And your Wandering Spirits would also have this note here, chance to gain mana when a Wandering Spirit disappears. So this is another way that you can try to eke out a little bit of mana from this and a little bit of mana from this. And it works, it's fine, but it's definitely not something that's going to solve your mana altogether. The similar way that Marrow Shards is fine, but it's definitely not going to solve your mana altogether. The very last thing is like Talfoon's Mirage. We can talk about this later as well, but it gives you mana gain when you dodge while channeling. First of all, primarily, these boots are insane for Ghostflame. I ended up using different boots instead because I was trying to eke out as much damage as possible. So I really wanted that physical ailment damage to moving enemies just to try to get a little bit more damage out of my build. But man, Ghostflame using Talfoon's Mirage, the dodge stuff, we're basically dodge capped while we're walking around. Use 81% here. But like, oh man, you can get a ton of dodge out of Talfoon's Mirage as well. And then that also helps to solve your mana. The tricky thing about Talfoon's Mirage is you're going to be killing enemies a lot, and your damage is going to be more than okay. So in low corruption, or for like normal content, these aren't really going to be generating mana for you. If you push to high corruption, or if you're pushing high in the arena, first of all, you're going to value that defense more. Second of all, you're going to have enemies that don't just die the first time you breathe on them. So you're going to be generating more ward and mana, more importantly, every time that you dodge an attack. So that's an important thing to talk about for mana considerations here. This build is very fun. Twitch chat really enjoys this build. Lots of people have said that they love this build. They want to see the planner. They want to try to emulate themselves. And I've also heard that a lot of people want to iterate on this build and try to make it even better. Take like their own spin on the build as well. I would call this build, frankly, putting on my tryhard hat, maybe high C tier, low B tier. This build is fine. It's cozy. It's very fun to play. And there's a reason that I played this build all the way to 100. I enjoyed playing it the entire time. But what's funny about that is my damage on the dummy, it's not particularly high. You'll see we can let the damage ramp up just a little bit here. But like obviously this monster's not moving, which means that it's not getting the 15% more damage from Bleed Overload in the Warlock skill tree, and it's not getting the 45% more damage that I get from my boots when the enemy's moving. And like my damage is going to be like maybe 200, maybe 220 is like the very highest number that I'll get while I'm just like hitting the monster here, or hitting the dummy here. So against bosses, we'll get like another 15% more damage because Blood Overload or Bleed Overload works on bosses as well. But there's like these conditional modifiers that, yeah, they kind of help. But even at the end of the day, if you want to say like my very peak damage is 250, in terms of an ailment build, I would say that the bare minimum for an ailment build to be like a good build in Last Epoch is about 200k. If your ailment build is dealing less than 200,000 damage, I think it needs work. And my build does about 200k damage, but it feels really good to play. You have a very zoomy playstyle, and you have this damage that's happening in front of you and behind you, which means that like as you approach an enemy, you start bleeding them. As you walk past an enemy, you're still bleeding them. And then we have bleed duration that's ticking on them as well. And like all the trash is going to die, and you don't need to kill every single big monster that you come across. And if you do find a big monster, you just like transplant on top of him, you walk in a circle, and like it's still just an easy playstyle because as you're killing one monster, you're also killing every other monster in the area because like you have this nice channeling movement skill as well. So the build feels a lot better than the damage on the dummies makes it look otherwise. So there's some considerations for that damage number there. I want to talk a little bit about the build. So we ended up being a bleed character here. And you saw that I got some couple items in the inventory that we can talk about as well. But, oh, sorry, I guess for the mana. We'll talk about the mana when we get to the gearing section. But let's take a look at the skills first. We'll take a look at the mastery and the gear and then a little bit about the blessings at the end of this section. You can always use the YouTube chapters to fast forward if you need to. So we are a bleed Ghostflame character. Primarily our sources of like applying bleeds to enemies will come from chance to bleed on our gear, and also these nodes here. It's like ignite and dam chance per second, and then all of this gets converted into bleed, so we're dealing with physical ailment damage over time character. We have 2 points down here for decrepit mortals. This is enemies take 15% increased damage when you apply the curse to them, and it's also like a physical damage over time, even though it's not bleed, so it benefits from a lot of our generic damage over time scaling. We have 3 points into Wraith form, giving us a whole bunch of dodge, and also gives us a nice reason to build as much intelligence as possible. I think as long as you're over 100 intelligence, you're doing pretty well. Obviously, you want more than 108. You can get like 120 or even 130 when you're like really min-maxing your character and you get better gear than I have here. So that's mostly what's going on for Ghostflame. We tried it with and without the Fiery Desecration node. This node feels amazing, especially for monoliths. If you really want to juice up your single target damage, you could try to like take this node off and then spec it into like maybe less damage taken or maybe a more damage modifier somewhere. But in terms of like doing monos or even doing arena, having the damage happen in a full circle felt amazing. So I'm really happy to include this here. Not a big deal. Not having any points of movement speed, I'm trying to deal damage, so I trimmed this, and I trimmed a couple points in defense as well in order to get as much damage as possible. Other things, we are a Lich, so we have the 2 signature Lich skills here. They're both signature. Don't talk to me. We have Reaper form first, again giving us another reason to stack as much intelligence as possible. We get dodge per intelligence from Ghostflame and armor per intelligence here. You'll see that as we have these skills turned on, we have both 76 armor and 81 dodge. This is slightly disingenuous because we are in a level 47 zone. So in a level 100 zone, those numbers go down a little bit, the percentages do, but you can cap your armor on this character and you can cap your dodge on this character. So that is kind of insane to me. I don't really get it, but it's something that the game allows. Cool. We also have a little bit of Mark for Death. It gives us a curse, which is valuable because we want the enemies to be cursed for various reasons, and also just lowers their resistance. We do have cast speed here, and this is important to talk about. The cast speed nodes, they look like it does nothing for us, but again, the most vulnerable portion of this character's life is when we are transplanting. So we literally have cast speed here, and a little bit of cast speed on my weapon as well, for the sole purpose of making the transplant as snappy as possible so that I don't spend much time being vulnerable in a state where I'm not channeling Ghostflame. That's the entire reason for the cast speed nodes here. For Death Seal, it's an incredibly stock standard way of speccing this. If you've seen it once, you've seen it 100 times. But we have the deadlock on the far left side. We have the pulsing wave of death around our character like this. And as we are Death Sealed, we're gaining dam stacks on ourselves, and those dam stacks translate into a generic more damage modifier from the Doom Call node here. So this helps our bleeds get juiced up just a little bit more as well. Rounding out the last 2 skills for us, we have Transplant. Transplant has a couple nodes for bleed chance, giving us more bleeds. It has synergy with Rip Blood, which of course Bleed Overload from the Warlock Mastery also has synergy with Rip Blood. And then we have all of our mana generation here. So this, along with the minus mana cost on my Scepter, and the idols for minus mana cost, and as much cooldown recovery speed as I could get, this is how we're solving mana. So these nodes, these 5 points up here. Important that we also have Bone Curse here. We like for the enemies to be cursed for various reasons. In Rip Blood is definitely a replacement tier, but it ends up being useful. If you wanted to put in Marrow Shards, for example, you could, but of course that's going to cost you 4 more points, or at least 1 more point over here. And I think for what Rip Blood does, it's just fine. We have a generic more damage modifier. We have some AoE and some more down here. We have Rip Blood hitting twice here and some extra bleed chance. Some people have said that Rip Blood hits 3 times. It does not. It only hits 2 times. Rip Blood, the first Blood Splatter does not shotgun on single target, but the second Blood Splatter does shotgun on single target. So if you have your Rip Blood spec like I do with 5 points here and 1 point here, the initial one will hit. The second one does not shotgun on single target. The second Blood Splatter does shotgun on single target. So we have 2 hits coming in from this one here. Let's take a look at our mastery real quick. You're going to see a little bit of bleed chance, a lot of generic nodes, and a lot of intelligence, along with anything that says damage over time and less damage taken. So we have our intelligence stuff here, vitality, and a little bit of percent increased damage. You could flex these over to armor as well, but intelligence gives you a ton of armor, so I felt like taking the damage is fine because I wanted as much damage as possible. So in the let's go to Warlock skill tree first because I think Warlock's fine. We need to pick up this Ghostflame skill. We have 5 points for the more damage over time to cursed enemies. Again, we want enemies to be cursed. Our mana is not perfect, so we're happy to take this node for some extra mana gain chance per curse to gain mana on hit against enemy. It's got a cooldown, but it's still fine. And then, of course, we're bleed builds. We're putting 5 points into the bleed overload and 4 points into the auto bomber playstyle, baby, with Rip Bloods proccing on the enemies around us. What this means is, like for trash monsters, we can kill them quite easily, but it also means that our leech is extremely consistent because we're leaving a bit of damage over time over here. We're leaving a bit of damage over time over here, and our leech is just very consistent the entire time, which is great. I like that. We have only 1 point in Ward of Malevolence and 8 into Doom Herald. This is less damage taken while channeling and more damage to damned enemies. And we have just a tiny bit of chance to apply dam on hit from our idols to make sure that we're getting that 24% more damage over here. If you wanted to go for a ward-based route, we can talk about differences between like Lich and Warlock, but I think if you're trying to do anything with Ghostflame and a Warlock, you absolutely take all of the ward synergies because that looks insane. But for me, I was playing like a life-based Lich using Death Seal, and I did not care about having as much ward as possible. In the Lich skill tree, you'll see a couple very basic-looking things, just like Intelligence, percent increased damage, triple while at low health. This is whenever my Death Seal is active. And our bleed chance, some vitality, intelligence, physical penetration. I put 10 points into this. This is less physical and less necrotic damage taken when I use a potion. This is a really good layer of defense. And then we have 5 points into generic leech, so we can leech from our bleeds, even though they're an ailment. And even more intelligence here, which is why it looks spooky with me walking around. But of course, anytime that I walk into an encounter, I do this, and all of a sudden, I'm back at full health. It's not a big deal. One important thing to note, as long as we're talking about the Dance with Death node here, I'll put this in the description as well, because this really is an important thing to mention. But this says percent increased damage when you are below 35% health, which of course you are when you're using Death Seal. Everything in last epoch snapshots. Everything, probably everything. I think it's safe to assume that everything in last epoch snapshots. So if I begin channeling my Ghostflame like this, and then I turn on my Death Seal, the more damage and the increased damage modifier that I get for turning on Death Seal does not affect my Ghostflame until I reset, I stop channeling Ghostflame, and I rechannel Ghostflame. Fortunately, there's like a built-in way to manage this, and that is Transplant, because when you are channeling your Ghostflame, if you hold down your Ghostflame and you click Transplant, of course, you've all of a sudden recast and you're restarting the channel of Ghostflame. So what this means in terms of playstyle, and again, this is important, so I'll put it in the description, is whenever you're channeling this, if you want to activate your Death Seal, just like Death Seal and then Transplant right afterward, and that means that you turned on your Death Seal, you've transplanted, you've restarted the channel of Ghostflame, which means that you are again benefiting from all of the damage from Death Seal. Cool. That is an important thing to talk about, and I'm glad that we can include that here. Let's move on to our gear. We have a lot of generic looking bleed things. Flayer's Pride, in my brain, it's kind of like a catalyst. I wanted to get tier 7% physical damage on this. You can get block chance if you want, but I feel like the build's sufficiently tanky as long as you're paying attention to when you transplant. So I really wanted as much percent increased damage as possible. For your Valdir's Chalice, obviously you want percent increased damage. You don't have Frailty anywhere in the build. It would be nice to get Frailty on a Valdir's Chalice. You could try to use a... Let's go grab an Ambition real quick. Ambition of the Lost Acolyte. Ambition of something, right? Ambition of the something Acolyte? Ambitions of an Erased Acolyte. There you go. You can try to reuse one of these as well because it has that +1 to Acolyte skills. But yeah, just something with like percent increased damage or the Frailty modifier on it. You could even get plus to all resistances while channeling. Ends up being a very good stat to have. But again, the time when you're going to die on this character is when you transplant, because that's when all your defenses are down. So I tried to I guess I'm currently over gearing, but I tried to accommodate that downside of the build by capping my resistances without using the resistance while channeling. Because every time that I transplant, I would lose all of my DR while channeling, and then I would also lose my my resistances as well. So like, I don't think that's a good place to be. I don't think it's good to rely on the res while channeling if you're also including, transplanting every once in a while. But if you have a different combination of ways to solve your mana, maybe that is something that you would feel comfortable relying on instead. Blood of the Exile, we talked about some more defensive boosts with Tel'Thrin's Mirage, but these are basically just here because they have that more damage modifier on them. I would like to have some hybrid health on my Atrophy. I'm actually quite low on HP. I only have 1900 HP, so I'm missing hybrid health on the boots, and I'm missing hybrid health here. I could have more health on my helmet, and I could have more health on my chest piece as well. So even these idols, the mana efficiency idols, they could have flat health as a suffix on them, which would give me like another 200 health if you have like perfect rolled stuff. So I think having this build with like 22 or 2300 life, you're going to feel pretty good about it. I don't think you're going to get much more than 2500 life unless you're like totally insanely well geared. But even 18 or 1900, it for all intents and purposes is like pretty good. For the other stuff, we talked about the helmets. +4 to Ghostflame is the most important thing. You'd rather have intelligence rather than vitality, because intelligence is giving you % increased damage. It's giving you ward retention for when you have ward. It's giving you dodge for while you're channeling, and it's also giving you armor for any time that you're in Reaper form, which is basically all the time. For your scepter, there's a couple options you can go for here, but we just look for that -5 spell mana cost in order to solve our mana as well as possible. Getting ignite is fine as well, because your ignite chance is getting converted to what is this? To bleed chance here. So that's an appropriate thing to be relying on as a suffix. For rings, intelligence and damage over time, intelligence and physical damage are both fine, but I think intelligence and strength is great as well. We have a ton of flat armor coming in from our Reaper form based on intelligence. We even have more flat armor coming in from our blessings that we'll talk about in just a moment here, like 563 flat armor. And we have a little bit of % armor from one of our blessings, but getting some extra % increased armor really does feel good while you are channeling here. So this is currently 76% armor, but in a level 100 zone, it goes down to like 71 or so. But you could cap that if you really wanted to, which is sweet. I like that. For the chest piece, there's nothing OP that you're looking for. I think bleed duration is the best stat for you, but like bleed duration and chance to bleed on hit are both prefixes that you're interested in, and then intelligence, health, and health. For our belts, there's a couple interesting pieces of spice before we move on to talking about other parts of the build. But for our belt, you could try to rely on something like this. This is an experimental belt prefix. It says mana gained on potion use. I don't think that this is sufficient to solve your mana. Even this plus marrow shards didn't quite feel like enough unless there's a lot of density around your character. But if there's a lot of density, I mean, they're going to die eventually, aren't they? So I don't think this is quite enough, but this was in the build for a long time, the mana gained on potion use. Another option, if you're going the cooldown route like I am, getting cooldown on your belt and cooldown on your boots in order to get transplant as a mana battery, is of course using the 1.2 or whatever seconds of traversal skill cooldown on potion use. Of course, you already have a reason to use your potions because in your mastery, you get a bunch of extra defense when using a potion, and then you also get cooldown for your transplant to get more mana back. So that could be another route that you take for trying to solve the complicated mana issue. Why is Warpath so easy to solve mana for? And this is so difficult to solve mana for? I don't know. That pesky Warpath there. Let's go on and talk about our idols real quick. We talked about these previously in the video here, but as much mana efficiency with Ghostflame as possible, a little bit of health, and then like maybe a res suffix, or just a double health idol like I have here. And then for these 3x1s, some dam on hit would be nice, and then cooldown recovery speed for transplant. Another option, if you're going Warlock, for example, you might care instead about getting that ward per second while channeling, because man, these ward per second while channeling are insane. You can get 450-ish ward per second, along with the, what is this node? Ward per second per 2 intelligence while channeling, along with the other, man, whew, those ward warlocks are kind of insane, aren't they? But we're playing a Death Seal Lich. We're playing life-based. It's fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. Everything's fine, I promise. Let's go to our blessings next, and we'll talk about this. We have a little bit of void resistance. You can go crit multi if you're playing the spell crit version of this build, trying to scale marrow shards damage, but otherwise, just void res is a great thing to ease the pressure of your gearing. Ending the storm, get some extra lightning res. There's nothing else here that really benefits us. Shock, the ward stuff doesn't really help us. The health regeneration stuff doesn't really help us. Just lightning res is fine. In Reign of Dragons, I ended up going for the crit avoidance route. If you wanted to do the crit reduction or like the fortify affix, you could do like reduced damage taken from, or reduced bonus damage taken from critical strikes. It's got a hybrid affix that has some armor on it as well. You can try to get that to like 50 or 60 or even 70. That's fine. But I ended up using one ring suffix plus a good roll of this blessing in order to solve my crit issue. For our 2 armor blessings here, we have armor and then armor, because armor is really, really, really strong. If you wanted more damage out of this build, Reign of Dragons has a percent chance to bleed blessing. So maybe that's a different way that you could go, and that would reward you for, you know, not relying on crit avoid, but instead relying on the fortify affix, the reduced bonus damage taken from critical strikes. I think that about does it. This build has been more fun than I thought it was going to be to play. I didn't expect that we were going to play Ghostflame for like a week and a half or so. But again, like the the damage numbers on the dummy and the damage numbers on the tier 4 Julra that you see at the very beginning of this video, they're a little bit lower than I would like them to be, but the playstyle is fine. And the tier 4 Julra, it's not one-shotting, it's not killing it in 30 seconds, but it's a completely appropriate time to kill for tier 4 Julra. I would call it on the low end, but like, it's really fine. I think a lot of new players who've been playing Last Epoch for only a month or so at this point, or maybe they played a long time ago and like they're really jumping back in 1.0, you might, if that sounds like you might have a skewed perspective of ward, you might have a skewed perspective of like how much damage things are dealing, or how much AoE your exploding ballista is supposed to be having. I feel like, as someone who's been playing Last Epoch for a long time, my perspective is maybe skewed in the opposite direction. Like, if I see something exploding and killing monsters off screen in a huge AoE circle, you kind of feel like something might be wrong there. In a similar way, you see like Dive Bomb one-shotting tier 4 bosses, and it's like, well, maybe something's wrong there. Maybe something's bugged. Maybe something is, maybe not bugged, but particularly really, really overtuned. So for this build, my damage is low. I recognize that. But it's really not that much lower than what I would call like a totally appropriate time to kill for tier 4 Julra. Killing tier 4 Julra in like a minute is something that you can be happy about for your build. You don't need to kill tier 4 Julra before she does her very first teleport within 10 seconds. That is an outlier, and that is not the norm. So hopefully that piece of insight is helpful to someone. We're going to move on from this build here. I plan on playing some more Liches because there's more stuff that I want to investigate. I would like to work with Chaos Bolt next, so I'm going to go see what we can do with a Lich playing a Chaos Bolt build. Maybe it's a damage over time thing, maybe with ailments, but I think the very first thing that I'm going to try is a spell crit character with Lich. So that's what we're going to be doing. This build has been pretty good, much more fun than I thought it was going to be. If you got questions or comments about how you are building this particular character, how you're building Ghostflame, or even how you're like solving for the mana situation on this. On a Warlock, you get a few more options, but as a Lich, I feel like it's kind of slim pickings, and you really just want as much mana cost as possible. That said, it's been a good build. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.